Cooking. Once again, for those who are joining us through the archives and not here live, this is the WebYeshiva Mastery of Halacha Program. This is the course on Kitchen and Shabbat, and our initial subject today is going to be having to do with cooking. Just as you are all new to this program, I too am new to it, and we're going to have to feel our way and see how things go. Before we actually begin the material, let me remind you that if you want to ask a question during class, feel free to click the hands up signal, and I can turn on your microphone, and then you can ask a question. Or you can always ask a question on chat, and I will see it on my screen and try to respond to your question during the shiur. If you're not here live, if you're picking up this shiur from the archive, feel free to ask me questions by email. I'll give you my email address on chat. Here you have on chat my email address. You can always send me a question on email, and I will respond, if not instantly, I hope within a day. Now, in addition, we are opening up a forum on the internet for you and for us, the teachers, a private forum just for the participants in this course and the parallel course on Wednesdays. That forum will be of use for a number of things. Specifically, if you are seeking a chavrusa, a study partner whom you can learn together with to prepare the material, either live or by telephone or by Skype, the forum will be a good place to do that. The forum will be used for all kinds of communication, for all kinds of collaborative effort, and you have on chat, Rabbi Rausman has been kind enough to give us on chat the link for entering that forum. Okay, that's enough introductory material. Now I want to begin the material itself, the stuff of the course, and we'll see how fast we go. The truth is, I don't know what our speed is going to be because I've never actually done this before. But we'll go step by step and see how far we get. The source materials have already been distributed to you, and let's see if we can. There, we got them on the screen. We're going to begin with the source materials step by step. Our first source that we're going to look at is from the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is, of course, divided into four parts. The first part of the Shulchan Aruch is the Orach Chaim, and the material which we have on the blackboard, as with all of my sources, the material is a direct word-for-word quotation from the classical sources in the source sheets, which are distributed online and on the blackboard that you see before you. You have the exact location, the exact source from which I've drawn this particular quotation. So I don't have to tell you verbally where it's from. You have written before you the exact location. I just say it's the Shulchan Aruch, and everyone knows how important that is. Let's take a look at this text. Kishem she'asur, just as it is prohibited, l'vashel b'ur, to cook with fire. Now this word ur, meaning fire, is a little bit tricky because exactly the same spelling can be the word or, which means light. But this is the word ur, which means fire. How do I know that it's ur and not or? Because it makes no sense to talk about cooking in light. It does make sense to talk about cooking in fire. So this is cooking in fire. Just as it is prohibited to cook in fire, kach, similarly, asur levashel b'toldata ur. It is similarly prohibited to cook in derivatives of fire. Kigon, for example, litain beitza b'tzad kedera. For example, to put, literally to give. Litain is to give. Means to put an egg at the side of a pot. what happens if you put an egg next to a pot? The pot was heated by the fire. The pot, in turn, heats the egg. That's a derivative of fire. The pot is not fire itself, but the heat in the pot is a derivative of fire, and it's also prohibited to cook with that. Or l'shabro, to break the egg, to break it, al sudar, on a cloth, shehu cham b'ur, which had been heated in fire. If the cloth was heated, if the source of heat is fire, then you're not allowed to put the egg there, kadesha titzla, so that the egg will be fried. You're not allowed to cook in fire, and similarly, you're not allowed to cook in derivatives of fire. Okay, now the key question which must be asked here is the Shulchan Aruch is giving us a comparison. Keshemshe, just as it is prohibited to cook in fire, kach, similarly, it is prohibited to cook in derivatives of fire. A comparison is being made. We must ask ourselves exactly what is being compared here. And this is something which you should think about. Well, what is the equality? What is the comparison? What is being set equal to what? Yeah, you can ask questions and you can answer questions also. Do any of you have any ideas? What is being set equal to what? What is being compared with what? When the Shulchan Aruch says, just as you're not allowed to cook in fire, similarly, what's similar? What's the similar thing? Yeah. I think you got it. I think you got it absolutely right. Oh, I shouldn't say the name of the person who said this because it was sent to me privately. But I think you've got it exactly right. What's being compared here is the level of the prohibition. Some things in Shabbat, as the Chol HaTorah Kula, are prohibited by the Torah. Other things are rabbinic prohibitions. Other things are local minhagim. Well, just as cooking in fire is a Torah prohibition, similarly, cooking in the derivatives of fire is a Torah prohibition. So here we have two categories which are equal. Category number one, cooking in fire, Torah prohibition. Category number two, cooking with heat derived from fire, also a Torah prohibition. Shulchan Aruch goes on and says, "Va'afilu b'toldat Hama," you know, Hama, languages go through historical periods. Everyone knows that. And as languages go through historical periods, vocabulary tends to change. In Tanakh, in biblical Hebrew, the word for sun is shemesh. In rabbinic Hebrew, in the Mishnah, and in the Middle Ages, the word for sun is Hama, the word we have before us. And so, of course, the Shulchan Aruch uses rabbinic Hebrew. Modern Israeli Hebrew prefers the biblical words, where there is a choice between rabbinic vocabulary and biblical vocabulary. Afilu b'toldat hachama, even in derivatives of the sun, even in derivatives of the sun, it is prohibited to cook. Kagon, for example, b'sudar shehu cham b'chama. For example, a cloth which was heated in the sun, a cloth which was heated in the sun, asur, you're not allowed to use that heat to cook with. Why not? Gezerah, this is a rabbinic edict, a rabbinic prohibition, atu, because of toldat ha'ur, because of derivatives of the sun. Let's understand first on a simple level what's going on, and we'll proceed step by step after that. We have the first two categories we already know. Torah prohibition to cook in the heat of the sun. Torah prohibition to cook with derivatives of the heat of the sun. Now, Torah prohibition to cook in the heat of fire. Torah prohibition to cook in the derivatives of fire. Now we have a third category, a rabbinic prohibition to cook in derivatives of the sun. You heat up something in the sun, heat up a brick, heat up a stone, make something very hot in the sun, bring it into the house, use that to cook with, and you've got a rabbinic prohibition. Why is it a rabbinic prohibition? Because the Shulchan Aruch says, Toldo ta'ur, people will make a mistake. People will become confused. If outside the house you heat up a brick, outside the house you heat up a stone with fire, or you heat it up with the sun, bring the hot object into the house, no one can tell by looking at the hot object whether it was originally heated by fire, in which case there's a true Torah prohibition to use it to cook food, or was it originally heated by the sun? There's no way to tell by looking. And therefore the rabbi said, no one should get confused. You're not allowed to use any object which was already heated, not allowed to use any object which was heated to cook with. If it was originally heated by fire, it's a Torah prohibition. If it was heated by the sun, it's a rabbinic prohibition. And now comes the big surprise. Well, you've already looked at the sources, I hope so. You're no longer surprised. You should have been surprised the first time you saw this. Aval, however, the Hama Atzma, in the sun itself, direct cooking in the heat of the sun. Kegon, for example, litain beitza b'chama, for example, placing an egg in the sunlight. O litain mayim b'chama, or putting water in the sun. Kadesha yuhamu, in order that it be heated up. Mutar is permitted, entirely, 100% permitted, no prohibition at all. According to this, if you set up a few mirrors outside the house, or a magnifying glass, or something like this, you can get incredibly hot temperatures in the sun, entirely permitted to cook in the direct heat of the sun. If it's indirect, you heat up an object, bring the object into the house. Now we have a rabbinic prohibition. How do we know, in the first case, that it was talking about an object that was heated in the sun? That's the whole concept of tolda, the meaning of the word tolda, which I translate derivative. The meaning of the word tolda means an object heated up in the fire and then used for cooking with, or an object heated up in the sun and then used for cooking with. That's what the word tolda means in rabbinic literature, and that's how I know it. So, of course, we're going to have to turn to the question of solar panels. And why is a magnifying glass not a derivative? We'll come to this with further sources. We definitely will come to that. A cold frying pan brought into the sun could be used to fry an egg outside, or to heat water, or how about a more practical example, things that people really do. Anyone who comes from California knows that in California, sun tea is very popular. What is sun tea? You take a glass pitcher of water, you put the tea in it, all this at room temperature, you put the pitcher of water with the tea leaves in it in the sun, come back a few hours later and you have warm tea, entirely permitted because it was in the sun, cooking in the sun. That's okay. Now, of course, we're left with a big question here. Why, oh, why is it permitted to cook in the direct heat of the sun, whereas everything else is either a Torah prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition? One would think that if cooking is prohibited, it shouldn't matter at all what you use as a source of heat. One would think that cooking in the sun should also be prohibited, but it isn't. And we need an explanation why not. It's going to take us a while to understand this, but we will eventually come to an understanding. In order to illustrate to you how important it is to come to this understanding, you have to realize that the prohibition of bishul, cooking on Shabbos, is not exactly the same as what we call cooking. If you speak different languages, you know that different languages have different words for cooking, baking, frying, roasting. Many languages have different words for all of these things, and the words don't always correspond from one language to another. In English, you boil water. In Yiddish, you cook water. In English, one would never say that. You cook water, but in Yiddish, it's the normal way of referring to the boiling of water. The correspondence of terminology is imprecise from one language to another, and therefore, we surely cannot say that when the Torah prohibits cooking, it prohibits whatever you happen to call cooking in your language. That has nothing to do. That surely has nothing to do with it. Consider the following point as well. Rambam says, Maimonides says flat out, that if you take a piece of metal, any metal, and heat the metal until it begins to glow red hot, heating a piece of metal until it begins to glow red hot is a violation of cooking on Shabbos. This clearly has nothing to do with food, even though in English and in most other languages, cooking has to do with food and not other stuff. The halachic category of bishul on Shabbos is by no means limited to food and by no means corresponds with what is normally called cooking in whatever language you happen to speak. Okay, let's summarize for a moment what we have, and then we're going to get into the deeper material. We know there are four categories. Two categories are Torah prohibitions of cooking. One category is a rabbinic prohibition of cooking. The fourth category is entirely permitted, no problem at all. Cooking in fire is a Torah violation. Cooking in anything that was heated by fire is a Torah violation. Cooking in the direct heat of the sun is entirely permitted. Cooking with something that was heated in the sun is a rabbinic prohibition. That's what we know so far. Let's go one step further. This idea, which I hope you find surprising the first time you encountered it, this idea that it's entirely permitted to cook in the sun, and you can get incredibly high temperatures if you cook in the sun. It's possible to do if you arrange things properly. I hope you find this idea surprising, and this should raise in your minds the question, is this an unusual opinion which just happened to find its way somehow into the Shulchan Aruch? Or is this an opinion which represents the mainstream thinking of all of the great authorities? That's an important issue. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. I suppose everyone is familiar with the Mishnah Berurah, probably the single most authoritative halachic work of the 20th century, published just over 100 years ago in Eastern Europe. Can't get more authoritative than the Mishnah Berurah. Let's see what he says in his commentary on the passage we just completed in the Shulchan Aruch, and he would be sure to tell us if we can or cannot rely upon the Shulchan Aruch. Is this a maverick opinion of the Shulchan Aruch, or is this a mainstream opinion regarding the prohibition of cooking in Toldat Ur, heat derived from fire? Mevashel bo chayev. Now, this word chayev, anyone who cooks in derivatives of fire is chayev, is guilty. This word chayev, guilty, has a specific and precise definition in halachic terminology. Chayev means guilty of Torah violation. The word chayev would not be used in a situation where you're guilty only of rabbinic violation. The word chayev means a Torah violation. Cooking in fire is a Torah violation. Cooking in the derivative of fire is a Torah violation. Lefichach, therefore, meniach perot o mayim ala tanur, therefore anyone who puts fruits or water on top of the oven, or b'toch hakachlon. Kachlon in Eastern Europe, back in the days of the Mishnah Berurah, the ovens were all made out of ceramic tiles. The ceramic tile is the kachel. So it doesn't matter whether you put the food on top of the oven or inside the tiles. It's all the same. Once the fire was in the oven, once the oven was heated by fire, it's a Torah violation to use that heat to cook with. Now, the reason they use these ceramic tiles, these were specially designed ceramic tiles. That's what they all used in Eastern Europe. In the old villages, there might be some old villages where you still see some of these ovens. They might still exist somewhere. But these old ceramic ovens, ceramic tile ovens, were designed with these tiles that hold the heat for a long time. You make a fire in the oven, and then even when the fire is out and there's nothing burning anymore in the oven, those tiles remain hot for a long time, radiate their heat, and keep the house hot for a long time. That's the way the ovens were made. So even though there's no fire in the oven at the moment, but the oven was heated by fire, so the heat has its origin in fire. It's a derivative of fire. The heat originally came from fire. Anyone who puts water or fruits on top of the oven, in the tiles, it's all chayev. It's all a Torah violation. Midrabanan, there's a rabbinic prohibition, which the Shulchan Aruch didn't mention, but the Mishnah Brura, for the sake of completeness, mentions it. Midrabanan, there's a rabbinic prohibition, asur, it is prohibited, lahaniach afilu kodem shuhusak, to put the food on the oven or in the oven even before it was heated. In Eastern Europe, back in the old days, the way it worked was on Shabbos. The non-Jew would go from house to house to light the ovens in the house to keep the houses warm. It's really cold in the winter in Eastern Europe. To keep the houses warm, everyone had their ovens, and the non-Jew would go from house to house lighting the ovens. So you know that the oven is going to be hot later in the day, even though there's no fire now. Even though there's no heat now, you're not allowed to put the food there because you know it's going to get hot and it's going to cook. You're not guilty of cooking as far as Torah violations are concerned because there's no heat of any source at the moment, but there is a rabbinic prohibition to put the food there where you know it's going to be cooked later on. Because you should start thinking about the timers, modern electronic timers, for cooking purposes, and we'll come to that in greater detail in a few weeks. Yeah, let's leave the snowball question aside because we're going to be getting to that. Melting ice is going to be a big issue for later in the semester. Yes, indeed, there's a prohibition of having non-Jews violate Shabbos for our benefit, but we are permitted to ask a non-Jew flat out to do whatever is necessary for the benefit of a sick person. I'm not talking about life-threatening situations, but even someone who's just ordinary sick. No one thinks he's going to die. No one thinks she's going to die, but just they're uncomfortable and they don't feel good because they're sick. You're allowed to ask a non-Jew flat out to do whatever is necessary to deal with sickness. And if you have ever been in a cold European winter, you know what it feels like to be cold. The way you feel when you are cold and shivering is exactly the way you feel when you are sick, when you have a fever. The halachic status of being sick does not depend upon the presence or absence of microorganisms in the blood. Right, in the days of Rambam, they didn't know about microorganisms in the blood. The halachic definition of being sick depends entirely upon how you feel. And since people feel in the cold exactly the way they feel when they have a fever, so you're allowed to ask the non-Jew flat out to light the oven to keep the house warm in the European winter. Okay, as far as electronic timers, we're going to get to, but it'll be a few weeks until we get to that. Why would it be a deraisa to light the fire after? It is. It is a Torah prohibition to to light the fire in the oven when the food is there. We're talking about a situation where a non-Jew is going to do it, and therefore the non-Jew is allowed to light the oven. You're just not allowed to put the food there where it's going to heat up. The Mishnah Berurah concludes by talking about cooking in the sun itself, the surprising position of the Mishnah Berurah, the surprising position of Shulchan Aruch. And here we're wondering, is the Mishnah Berurah going to give his seal of approval to the leniency of the Shulchan Aruch to permit cooking directly in the sun? Or is he going to say, well, that there is such an opinion, but we really are strict and we reject that opinion? Lo gazrinin, we do not prohibit. Lo gazrinin, we do not prohibit cooking in the sun. Atu ur, because it can be confused with cooking in fire. We do not prohibit cooking in the sun because that can be confused with cooking with fire. Techama b'ur lo michlaf, because no one would confuse the sun with a fire. Anyone, you see someone cooking in the sun, no one will think, oh, maybe he's cooking in the fire. It doesn't make any sense. It's totally different. Cooking in a solar heater with mirrors or magnifying glass or whatever is totally different from cooking with fire. No one would confuse the two procedures, and therefore there's not even a rabbinic prohibition of cooking in the sun. Flat out, it's okay. Now, I don't know whether any of you, atu means because of. I don't know if any of you are survivalists, but you can buy on the internet solar heaters for camping. They're good for all kinds of purposes, and you can cook anything that you can cook in the kitchen. You can cook in a solar heater. It just takes longer. It takes a while for it to really heat up, but you can get things really hot, and you can cook in the sun, entirely permitted on Shabbos. Okay, that's what he says. Now we're going to turn to what the great modern poskim have to say about all this. And when we look at the words of the great modern poskim, we're going to come to a much deeper understanding of the nature of the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos, and we'll be able to apply that deeper understanding to all kinds of important conclusions. Our first source among the great Acharonim, the great modern poskim, is the Tzitz Eliezer. His name was Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg. He was originally from Baghdad, but came as a young man to Yerushalayim and basically grew up here in Israel. He became one of the greatest of the rabbis in Israel in the 20th century. For many, many, many years, he was the head of the Bet Din. He was the head of the rabbinic court of the chief rabbinate of Israel, an extraordinarily influential position. He wrote tons of rabbinic literature, which is immensely influential. Let's see what he says. He was asked about the solar water heaters, which are very, very common in Israel. In the state of Israel, by law, every new residence must have a solar water heater on the roof. Even though he's from Baghdad, he's Ashkenazi. The family was Ashkenazi. The family had been living in Yerushalayim. The Turks kicked his family out of Yerushalayim, out of Eretz Yisrael. They didn't want to go very far. They went to live in Baghdad, hoping to be able to return to Yerushalayim when things calmed down again. The Tzitz Eliezer was born in Baghdad, but then shortly after that, the family did return to Yerushalayim. I spoke with him a number of times, and I can assure you that he spoke Yiddish better than I can. Let's see what he has to say. He was asked about these solar water heaters. The way it works, the way the solar water heaters work is like there's no electricity at all. You have these rectangular panels. In the rectangular panels, here this is on the ground, but in Israel it's usually on the roof of the house. In the rectangular panels, there are thin copper pipes. The copper pipes are filled with water supplied by the city, ordinary water coming from the city water supply. The sun shines on the rectangular panels, heating up the water in the copper pipes. Now, as you know, hot water tends to rise, just like hot air tends to rise in the room. That's because the molecules are further apart, less dense, and since it's less dense, the hot water rises. What happens is the hot water migrates. The hot water rises into the cylindrical tank, which is higher than the panels. Now, the cylindrical tank has an intake and an outtake. The hot water rises from the rectangular panels into the bottom of the tank, thereby pushing out water which was already there from the top. So the freshly heated water flows into the bottom of the tank, pushing out water from the top of the tank. The water from the top of the tank then circulates back down to the bottom of the rectangular panels, and as the water heats, it's constantly, slowly, very slowly, but constantly circulating from the panels up to the tank, back down to the panels, constantly circulating. Every time the water goes through a cycle, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and anyone who has a solar water heater, just about everyone in Israel has one, knows that you can get scalding hot water fairly quickly if the sun is shining. Now this is the source which almost everyone in Israel uses for hot water for bathing with. Right now, all our showers and bathtubs generally are connected with these gadgets, and sometimes it's called a dud shemesh. In Hebrew, it's called dud shemesh. Sometimes there is no sun. We live in a very sunny area, but sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's rainy, sometimes you need hot water at night when there is no sun, and therefore the cylindrical panel the cylindrical tank is usually equipped with an electric heating element, and in the house you can flip a switch to turn on the electric heating element in the cylindrical tank. That'll heat the water if there is no sun. But usually you want to save energy. That's the whole reason they have these things, is to save electricity. So you let the sun do the job. Okay, that's the way it works. And our author, the Tzitz Eliezer, was asked, what about Shabbos? On Shabbos, are you allowed to turn on the hot water in the house, use the hot water from the solar heater to wash dishes with, to give the baby a bath, to wash your hands? Are you allowed to use that hot water on Shabbos? Is this somehow a violation of cooking, or is it okay? That's what they asked him. Now, before we see his answer, let's understand something which all the poskim already figured out a generation earlier. In the United States, in Europe, in most places where they do not have these solar water heaters, hot water in the house for showers, hot water in the house for washing dishes and so forth and so on, hot water comes from either an electric boiler or a gas-powered boiler. That's the normal thing in most places in the world. Now here, the hot water in the boiler in an ordinary house was heated by gas or electricity, whatever it was heated with. That you're surely not allowed to do on Shabbos, because that's surely cooking either with a gas flame or with electricity. The electricity in turn was generated by heat somewhere, by a fire somewhere in a generating plant. Using electricity to heat water or a gas flame to heat water is surely prohibited on Shabbos. But what happens if you turn off the gas flame before Shabbos? What happens if you turn off the electricity before Shabbos and now you just have a tank full of hot water? Are you allowed to use that hot water on Shabbos? There is no electricity. There is no gas flame because you turned it off before Shabbos. Are you allowed to use that to wash the dishes with? Well, the poskim already figured out that that is surely prohibited. And the reason an ordinary boiler is prohibited is because every time you turn on the hot water in your sink to wash dishes with, or the shower, or wherever you're turning the hot water on, every time you turn hot water on, cold water from the water company flows into the boiler. And even though the flame is switched off, and even though the electric heating element is turned off, cold water flowing into the tank is going to be heated by the hot water which is already there. Now we are heating fresh, cold water by means of hot water which is already in the tank, and that hot water had been cooked, had been heated with fire. It turns out that the new cold water going in is being heated b'toldat ha'ur, by heat derived originally from fire. Therefore, turning on the hot water, draining the hot water from the tank on Shabbos, by using the hot water in your house, is surely a Torah prohibition, because you're going to be cooking, you're going to be heating fresh, cold water flowing into the tank is going to be heated by the hot water which is already there. That's an electric boiler. That's a gas boiler. But what about these solar heaters? That's the question which they asked the Tzitz Eliezer. Our electricity is all made by heat. All of our electricity is made in generating plants which use steam power. The steam is made by burning whatever fuel they use to burn, or even a nuclear power plant. The steam is made. The steam powers the turbines. The turbines make the electricity. All of our commercial electricity comes originally from a fire source. Okay, Dude Shemesh, we're going to talk about turning off electricity. We'll come to this. In theory, as you point out on chat, in theory it would be possible to turn off the intake valve and prevent fresh water from flowing into the tank when you use it on Shabbos. In theory, that would be possible, but in point of fact, this would create a vacuum and there'd be no way to get the hot water out. The only way you get the hot water out of the tank is by the pressure of cold water being pushed in. I just got a message. I don't know what to do with it. Okay. Now we understand what we're talking about. Let's see his tshuva. These are the words of the Tzitz Eliezer. L'fi ani yodati, in my humble opinion, and yet you have to know that whenever the poskim, whenever the great rabbis express themselves modestly, well, we should ignore their expressions of modesty. No one told him he had to publish this book. He decided to publish this opinion. The very fact that he chose to publish it means that he is 100% committed to the opinion he's about to express. He formulates his opinion in a modest way. In my humble opinion, he sounds like don't trust me, but really that's just a formal expression of humility which we will ignore. In my humble opinion, Iker, the basic yesod, the basic foundation of this issue, sheyesh lavo bazeh, the basic issue that we have to come to here, lahatir, the basic issue that we need to permit hashimush, the use of mayim, water, midudei shemesh, the main principle to permit the use of the solar water heater on Shabbos, humasha kotev kvod torato, is exactly what you wrote in the question you sent me. B'sof devarav, at the end of your question, ki ein zeh mayim shehuchmu b'toldot hachama, the water in the solar water heater is not being heated up with heat derived from the sun. Rather, it is being heated directly in the sun. And we know that heating water or any other cooking directly in the sun is okay. Ki'im kamayim shehuchmu b'chama atzmo, the water being heated in the rectangular panels is being heated directly in the sun. Shebechichai gavne, in this way, lekuli alma, everyone agrees, Share, it is permitted. The Shulchan Aruch said it's permitted. The Mishnah Berurah said there is no other opinion, leading us to be strict, and therefore it is simply permitted, period, permitted. One is allowed to cook in the sun, and that is what you're doing with a solar water heater, no problem at all. And then he brings all the sources, and the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch, and the Gemara, which say all this over and over again. Let's go one step further. These are still the words of the Tzitz Eliezer. Kolea hu ha'hezber. The explanation hits the mark. This explanation is correct. Shemazbir Kvod Torata, which you explain, he's writing this in response to someone who asked him a question. You're absolutely correct. Mipnei sheharei mayim eila, this water, mitchamamim ba'avram b'miklatim, this water gets heated up when it passes through the rectangular panels. Nowadays, they call the rectangular panel in Israel the kolet. He called it the miklat. Nowadays, they call it the kolet. That's the rectangular panel. The water gets heated up in the rectangular panel. Hem tzinorot shel matechet. Those are metal pipes. These copper metal pipes are used. Ha'omdim lahedya mul karnei hashemesh. The copper pipes are exposed to direct sunlight. Ein hamayim mitchamamim mechamat chom hatzinor. The water in the pipes is not being heated up. This is such an important point. The water in the pipes is not being heated up by the pipe. Ella, rather, yashar machom karnei hashemesh. The water is being heated up directly by the rays of the sun. Now, this is a terribly important point. Let's understand what it is he's saying. The following, according to him, is wrong. It's wrong to say the sun heats the pipe heats the water. If you would say that, which he thinks is wrong, if you would say that, that's another way of saying that the water is being heated in toldat hachama, in a derivative of sunlight. Sunlight heats an object, the object heats the water, and that would be a rabbinic prohibition, which we know from the Shulchan Aruch. But all that's wrong, he says. Rather, the water is being heated directly by the rays of the sun. It is as though the copper pipe is not there. It is as though the rays of the sun fall directly on the water. It's wrong to say that the rays of the sun heat the pipe, but the pipe heats the water. That's wrong. What's correct, he says, is that the sun directly, this surprises you, I hope so. I hope this surprises anyone who lives after the 17th century. Let's go one step further, because it becomes even more surprising. Even though it's true that the pipe gets warm a little bit, even though it's true that the pipe gets a little bit warm, the pipe never gets warm enough to heat the water. The pipe gets a little bit warm in the sun, but the water in the pipe gets very hot. And anyone who's used one of these, and we have them in all our houses in Israel, he knows that the water gets scalding hot. In fact, if you have little children, you have to be careful because they can really get injured. The water is very hot. You get seriously burned. But he says the copper pipes never get hot. A little bit warm. Only the water in them gets scalding hot. The water goes through the pipes several times. Right? We learned before that the water through convection migrates through the system. The water circulates through the system a number of times. Every time the water goes through the pipes, the water gets a little bit hotter. Next time the water goes through the pipes, it gets a little bit hotter, until the water is eventually very hot. But the pipes were never very hot. The whole palm, every time, the water absorbs a little bit more heat until the water gets scalding hot, but the pipes were never so hot. So it's simply not true, he says. It's simply not true that the sun heats the pipes, and the pipes in turn heat the water. What's really happening here is that the sun directly heats the water. Now this is beyond surprising. This is in the dimension of being flabbergasting. This is beyond surprising. But back in Renaissance Italy, not so long ago in the grand scale of history, back in Renaissance Italy, they were very interested in science as well as many other things. They were Renaissance men, you know. So some of those Renaissance men back in Italy performed the following experiment. They took a cannon which was being made. Cannons, you know, for firing cannonballs. Cannons are made by casting a solid cylinder of metal, and then the center is drilled out. The center is bored out. That's the way cannons are made, in order that they be very strong. Now the filing, the drilling of the cannon bore produces a huge amount of very hot iron filings, which come out of the cannon as the bore is being made. They took a bucket of water, put a thermometer in the water, and one at a time would add hot iron filings to the bucket. Now, what they thought was going to happen was that every time you add a unit of heat, a little bit more of hot iron to the bucket of water, every unit of heat which is added from another piece of hot iron, they thought the temperature of the water would rise, and you would see that on the thermometer. They were surprised to discover that that is true only to a certain point. At a certain point, Dove Weinstein, your microphone is on. You wish to speak? No? Okay, I turn your microphone off. Someone else wishes to speak? Not at the moment. They were surprised to discover that the temperature of the water rose to a certain point and then remains constant. It didn't matter how much more hot iron you put into the water. It doesn't matter how many more units of heat you put into the water. The temperature of the water would never rise above the temperature of the iron filings which were being added. This was a great discovery back in Renaissance Italy, that hot metal, any hot object, is unable to heat up another object higher than the temperature of the first object. The hot iron cannot heat up the water to a temperature greater than the temperature of the hot iron. That was a big discovery in medieval, at the end of the Middle Ages, Renaissance Italy, and that discovery created the new theory of heat, which we have today, which is called the caloric, caloric theory. Okay, now the modern understanding of heat, according to which it is simply impossible for a hot piece of metal to heat up water above the temperature of the metal. That's the currently accepted theory, and it's been demonstrated over and over again by experimental science. Flies in the face of the facts as presented by the Tzitz Eliezer. According to Tzitz Eliezer, the copper pipes don't get very hot. The water does. This is simply impossible, according to our understanding of science, and experimental results fly in the face of what the Tzitz Eliezer has to say. Let's see if we can have some understanding of what's going on here. The Tzitz Eliezer, of course, is not interested in the science of a thermometer. The Tzitz Eliezer is, of course, not interested in the science of thermodynamics. As interesting as thermodynamics might be, he does not care one bit about it. All he cares about is halacha. And from the halachic point of view, we have to measure heat. From the halachic point of view, we have to measure heat not by what the thermometer says. Rather, we must measure heat by the way we experience it. It's our experience of heat which makes something hot. I'll give you a few examples of what I'm talking about, and then you'll understand right away. I bake bread. Every week for Shabbos, I bake a few loaves of bread. I do this almost every week. How do I do it? I take the dough. After the dough has been kneaded and shaped into the proper form, I place the dough on a piece of aluminum foil on the counter. I let it rise again. After it's risen again and ready to go into the oven is preheated, very, very hot oven. When you bake with yeast doughs require a very hot oven. The oven is very hot. I open the oven door. I pick up the aluminum foil by the edges and place the dough in the oven. Close the oven door. Come back 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later, depending on how big the loaf of bread is. Open up the oven door, reach in with both hands, grab the aluminum foil by the edges, take it out, put it in the correct place, close the oven door again. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you will realize that the aluminum foil, which was in the very hot oven of 270 degrees centigrade, 400 degrees Fahrenheit, the aluminum foil, which was in the oven for half an hour, is very hot. 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 270 degrees centigrade, very hot. Nonetheless, I have no problem at all grabbing it with my fingers and moving it to the counter, because the aluminum is so thin that the heat content is very low, and therefore I have never burnt my fingers by holding on to the aluminum foil. If I would grab the loaf of bread in my hand straight out of the oven, I would come away with second, third degree burns on my hand. I don't touch the bread. I only pick up the aluminum foil. Now, the bread and the aluminum foil are exactly the same temperature, which is exactly the same temperature as the ambient atmosphere in the oven, which is 275 degrees Celsius or around 370, 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very hot. But since the heat content is very low in the aluminum foil, I do not burn my fingers. I would burn my fingers if I touched the bread. Now, from the halachic point of view, that bread which was heated up with fire is, from the halachic point of view, very hot, and if I would take it out of the oven on Shabbos and sprinkle water on it, that water would get heated up by the bread. That would be cooking on Shabbos. But the aluminum foil is incapable of cooking anything, because there's not enough heat content in it. The temperature of everything in the oven is very high, but the number of calories, the amount of energy, the amount of heat energy varies from object to object, depending upon whether there's higher or lower heat capacity in the different objects. Bottom line, a thin piece of aluminum foil is incapable of cooking anything. It can't have enough energy stored in it from the heat to do any cooking at all. A thick piece of metal in the oven would hold much more heat energy and would indeed be able to cook things. What does cook and what does not cook depends not upon the temperature, but upon whether or not the heat energy is enough to cook another object. The thin copper pipes never get hot enough to actually burn your finger or heat up anything else. The amount of energy which the thin copper pipes can hold is very small. The water, on the other hand, has a much higher heat capacity and gets very, very hot. I'll give you a few more examples, and you'll understand more clearly what I'm talking about. Many of you live in countries in Europe or in America, in countries which have very cold winters. I remember in a previous Gilgul of mine, when I lived in a country with very snowy, cold winters, as a boy, if you would go out and play in the snow, you get very, very cold, very, very cold. Your ears would begin to ache with cold. And soon, your mother would call out to you and say, "Get back in the house, it's too cold for you to play out there." And of course, the children would never obey their mothers. They'd continue playing for another half hour. But eventually, the mothers would prevail, and the children would come back into the house. And mothers, being mothers, said, "Oh, you just came from playing outside. You have to wash your hands when you come into the house." You put your hands under cold water flowing from the faucet in the house. The cold water flowing from the faucet in the house feels so warm. It feels like such hot water because that water, cool as it is warmer than the surface temperature of the skin, which got very cold outside. And the cold water coming from the faucet in the house, coming from the tap in the house, feels very warm. Halacha depends not on what the thermometer says, rather halacha depends upon what we experience. Back in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, back in the days of the Rambam, they did not have thermometers. Heat was measured by experience. I have a large collection of cookbooks. I have cookbooks from colonial America. Lovely recipes from colonial America. A lovely recipe for cherry pie, beginning with 30 pounds of flour and 40 pounds of cherries. You know, in colonial America, there was a single oven for the whole town, and everyone baked together a single huge cherry pie. But back in colonial America, recipes would often say, heat up the mixture until it reaches the temperature of fresh milk. Right? Back in those days, the housewife who would go out and milk the cow knew exactly how fresh milk feels, the temperature of fresh milk coming straight from the cow. That's something which the housewife knew from experience what it feels like. And many recipes would say, you heat up the mixture until it gets to that amount of heat. Back in those days, they had no thermometers. It follows, therefore, that halacha cannot depend upon a thermometer. Halacha cannot depend upon something which didn't exist in those days. Rather, halacha depends upon our experience, our feeling of heat, not what the thermometer tells us. You know, matzah has to be baked with room temperature water. The water used for making matzah must stand overnight until it reaches room temperature. You're not allowed to use warm water for making the dough for matzah. The poskim say that therefore you cannot go into the mountains where the snow is melting and use the water which is freshly melting from the snow. The fresh runoff, the freshly melted water from the snow is called hot water. Why is it called hot water? Because if you put your hands in it, it feels so warm. It's just a little bit above freezing, but it feels so warm because your hands are colder in the winter weather. And when you put your hands in the water, which is just a little bit over freezing, that water feels so warm. But what is halachically warm and what is halachically cold does not depend upon what the thermometer says, but rather upon our experience. So with this, we come to the end of our first hour. We're going to pause with this. I know I didn't get to all of your questions on chat, but I'm going to copy them and respond to you in email for your questions on chat. And if you have further questions, feel free to get in contact with me by email during the week. Look forward to seeing you all again a week from tonight. Shavua Tov and Shalom Shalom.